Welcome back, everybody, and I will just introduce our second speaker of the morning, who is Senator Michael McDowell. Michael McDowell is a serving senator in Shannon, having been elected as an independent member in 2016 and re-elected in 2020. In his capacity as senator, he is a member of the Justice Committee and the Committee on European Affairs. In July 1999, Michael McDowell was appointed Attorney General of Ireland and served in that post until June 2002. He has served as Minister for Justice, Equality and Law Reform and as Taoiseach from 2006 to 2007. Michael McDowell's presentation today is entitled A Justified Struggle. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael McDowell.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And can I, at the very outset, thank the committee of the Sean McDermott Summer School for the honour and the pleasure of being asked to participate in today's event. I've been very concerned for some time with the argument that somehow the War of Independence was unjustified, that Ireland could have attained its independence without bloodshed or without violence, and that in some sense that the loss of life and the huge disruption to Ireland was in some sense illegitimate and improper. And the theme of what I want to talk about today is the following. First of all, that it was by no means inevitable at the end of the 19th century and the commencement of the 20th century that Ireland would become independent, that the circumstances that led to our independence were, so to speak, odds against, and that the people who believed in a wholly independent Ireland were a small minority of Irish people at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And what happened thereafter is, I believe, a remarkable set of consequences and coincidences which interacted with each other to create the circumstances that in 1921, 100 years ago, the War of Independence came to an end with a truce, and Ireland became an independent state for the first time. Now, going back to the early years of the 20th century, we have to see on the island of Ireland a divided society. Belfast as a city had a bigger population than Dublin. Belfast had heavy industry, an emerging working class. The south of Ireland, by contrast, was in an economic backwater. It was mainly producing agricultural and food products for the British market. Its population was in decline, and it was effectively an economic backwater of the United Kingdom. In those circumstances, we have to look internationally to see what was happening. Firstly, that across Europe there was a surge of nationalism in the Balkan states and the like. But more importantly than that there was a cultural revival in Ireland on two fronts. There was the Irish language revival headed by Douglas Hyde and my grandfather Owen MacNeill, and Pádraig Pearse subsequently. And there was a literary revival in terms of theatre, art, music, and poetry as well. So a significant cultural revival was taking place in Ireland. We were to have our first national university in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, the other thing that we have to remember is this, that we were part of the United Kingdom, which was the central component of the British Empire, the largest empire ever established on this planet, and the most powerful. And although we now know in retrospect that the First World War marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire in many respects, in that it was about to transform into what is now called the Commonwealth, and the Westminster Parliament was to lose its dominance from the year 1920 to the Statute of Westminster in 1931. At the time, we have to remember that it was very unlikely that a small state, which was a small island like Ireland, which was divided into two communities, the one dominated by the Unionist belief in Northern Ireland and the nationalists in the south, that this state was going to obtain its independence from the greatest empire in the world at a time when that empire, as I said, was considered to be all powerful. And I just want to bring to your attention one or two things about people talk about the Home Rule movement as if it was a necessary stepping stone to the creation of an independent Irish state, or that independence would inevitably flow from the establishment of Home Rule parliaments in Ireland. Well, firstly, we know that the Home Rule Act of 1914 was already in serious trouble because of internal Westminster opposition to it, and that the Asquith government and subsequently Lloyd George had effectively guaranteed to the Unionists in Northern Ireland that they would be allowed opt out of Irish Home Rule. And secondly, we know that those who aspired to Home Rule were consciously doing so on the basis that Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom and at the centre of the British Empire. And I just draw to your attention an interesting speech that John Redmond made on St. Patrick's Day in 1913. And he was speaking at a dinner about the forthcoming Home Rule Act as he saw it coming into effect. And he said the following. He said, "We will, under Home Rule," this is talking about the Irish, "devote our attention to education, reform of the poor law, and questions of that kind which are purely domestic, which, if you like, are humdrum Irish questions. And the only way in which we will attempt to interfere in any imperial question will be by our representatives on the floor of the Imperial Parliament in Westminster, doing everything in our power to increase the strength and glory of what will then be our empire at long last, and by sending in support of the empire the strong arms and brave hearts of Irish soldiers and Irish sailors to maintain the traditions of Irish valor in every part of the world. That is our ambition." So this is now before the outbreak of the First World War. That's John Redmond actually saying that Home Rule, as he saw it, was effectively to deal with domestic Irish issues only, and that Ireland was to share as part of the United Kingdom in the strength and the power of the British Empire, and that Irish men were to serve in its armed forces and to increase the strength and glory of that empire. So that's one view of what Home Rule was likely to achieve. And the second thing is that in 1920, 2 years after the 1918 election, where Sinn Féin had got most of the seats in Southern Ireland and was busily establishing Dáil Éireann, in 1920, the Westminster Parliament passed another act, the Government of Ireland Act, which repealed Redmond's Home Rule Act and provided for the establishment of two parliaments in Ireland. And I think it's worthwhile looking at at what was provided for in the Government of Ireland Act. Some people sort of think that Home Rule, as envisaged there, was something similar to what happened in the Free State, but it wasn't. First of all, the United Kingdom, both parliaments in Ireland were to be still subject to the supreme authority of the Parliament at Westminster, and the Section 75 of the Act said that the supreme authority of the United Kingdom Parliament was preserved over all persons, matters and things in Ireland and every part thereof. And the second thing about the Government of Ireland Act was that it kept back for the British government in Westminster all matters to do with defence, foreign affairs, international trade, and currency matters. So, and it also preserved the right of the Westminster Parliament to declare war and to, in those circumstances, rule in Ireland by emergency laws when the empire was at war. Now, the executive power in Ireland was to be vested in a Lord Lieutenant who would choose ministers and who could choose ministers who weren't even elected to the Southern Parliament. And you'd be glad to know, those of you who are interested in senates, that the Senate of the Southern Parliament was to consist of the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, the Lord Mayor of Dublin and Cork, 17 senators to be nominated by the Lord Lieutenant himself, representing industry, trade, and other matters, 4 Roman Catholic archbishops, 2 Church of Ireland archbishops, 16 peers of the realm. These are members of the English peerage who resided in Ireland, 8 privy councillors, and finally 14 persons elected by county councillors, and they were to hold office for 10 years as senators. Now, I just paint that picture to demonstrate that as late as December 1920, which was well into the War of Independence, and which was just 6 months before the truce was called in the War of Independence, the British government was still intent on creating in Ireland that kind of subordinate regional legislature in the south and a similar one in Northern Ireland, and that the British government was determined at that time to maintain complete control of the island of Ireland through the domination of the Westminster Parliament in all matters to do with international relations. So any suggestion that Ireland was at that time on the verge of independence and that the War of Independence made no difference is completely misconceived. What was on offer in late December 1920 was a non-independent, subordinate legislature dealing with the kind of humdrum domestic issues that John Redmond had spoken about back in 1913. And Ireland was to remain part of the United Kingdom and to be part of a single kingdom, which was to be at the centre of the British Empire. And the idea that Ireland was to have any real national independence was simply not on offer. So that being the case, that was the stated position of the Parliament at Westminster as to how they intended to impose a settlement on Ireland, which would have had a partition as part of it, obviously, because Northern Ireland would have had its own parliament, and there would have been a room for a Council of Ireland. That whole constitutional settlement was one which the British government and the British Parliament really hoped they could bring into effect in Ireland and create a new peace on the island of Ireland with those institutions, and to stop the War of Independence and to create a new settlement in Ireland where Ireland would be part of the United Kingdom. And therefore, you have to ask yourself, what changed between December 1920, when that was passed and received the royal assent in Westminster as the solution, to what happened in Downing Street in December of 1921, 1 year later. Over the course of that period, we know that the War of Independence intensified, and that Lloyd George, who was a prime minister in a coalition government between Liberals and Tories, sent out feelers to the Sinn Féin movement and to those who were conducting the War of Independence to say that he was interested in negotiation with the Irish. And we also note that although the massive repression and brutality of the Black and Tan movement, where the Prime Minister had said that he had murder by the throat in Ireland, and Cork, the centre of Cork, was burned, and there were atrocities committed by Crown forces across the country. That campaign was still at its height. But international pressure was coming on Britain to come to some agreement with the Sinn Féin movement, which had effectively captured the hearts and minds of the Irish people. And we know that in the summer of 1921, there was a truce, and that the IRA effectively came into the open, recruited more people, set up training camps, and started a negotiation process with De Valera visiting Lloyd George in London, and commencing the process of setting the scene for some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, one thing, by the way, that I think a lot of people aren't told about these days is that when the Dáil Éireann convened in 1918 and 1919 after the general election, where Sinn Féin had done hugely well in effectively annihilating the Irish Parliamentary Party of Redmondites, one of the things they did was to declare independence in a formal declaration of independence, acknowledge that Ireland was a republic, and retrospectively validate the proclamation of an independent Irish state which was done in 1916 by those who participated in the 1916 Rising. But when they did that, they didn't use the phrase that you see on the proclamation, which we all see around the country from time to time, copies of it, Publicht na hÉireann. The 1919 Dáil Éireann description of the Irish state was, curiously, Saoirseáit Éireann. The word Publicht was not used, and the word Saoirseáit was used. And when De Valera went first to meet Lloyd George, the one thing that they could agree on was that the term Saoirseáit Éireann, which was on the note paper that Eamon De Valera had used in correspondence with Lloyd George, was a satisfactory description of Ireland as far as Lloyd George was concerned. So when we use the term Saoirseáit, it was used by the Sinn Féin members of Dáil Éireann in 1919 as the title of the Irish state, and it proved, when we now hear the term Free State, we should gather, I think, that this was another strange coincidence at the time, that the term Publicht had been abandoned in the favour of Saoirseáit by Dáil Éireann itself in 1919. But a thing that I think that we have to remember about the War of Independence was that it was prosecuted effectively by the leadership of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and in particular people like Collins and Mulcahy and others, who had an ambivalent relationship with Dáil Éireann. Eamon De Valera and Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack attempted to assert control on behalf of the provisional government which had been established by Dáil Éireann in 1919 over the conduct of the War of Independence. And there was right across the period from 1919 to 1921 quite a power struggle between De Valera, Brugha, Stack on the one hand, and Collins and Mulcahy and others on the other hand, for control of the War of Independence. De Valera had been out of the state in America, and he was anxious to establish the supremacy of the ministry established by Dáil Éireann over the War of Independence. But the IRB element, which controlled the IRA, was determined to effectively keep control of the progress of the War of Independence itself. And if you look at how the armed struggle began at the Salahead Beg ambush in early 1919, right through to the truce in mid-summer of 1921, those 2.5 years were ones in which Michael Collins and a small group of people effectively conducted an urban and rural guerrilla campaign against the Crown forces in Ireland. It was a highly successful operation because it was quite unlike 1916. It attempted to avoid spectaculars. It attempted to take advantage of guerrilla tactics and strategies. It attempted to isolate the Crown forces, particularly the RIC and the British Army, from the Irish people, and to drive a wedge between the RIC and the Irish people in a way which effectively drove the RIC out of small towns, concentrated them in larger towns, made their barracks effectively contested locations. And it consisted of assassination as well of people who were leading the Crown forces and the Crown intelligence campaign against the IRA. Some of those things didn't really attract Eamon de Valera's sympathy, and he was, when he came back to Ireland, he was on occasions repelled by the shootings and the assassinations and some of the steps taken by the IRA to prosecute their campaign, including executions of informers or suspected informers and things like that. And the tension between Collins and Mulcahy on the one hand and Brugha on the other hand was a running theme from Eamon de Valera's return to Ireland to the very signing of the treaty in December of 1921. Now, we have to ask ourselves, would Ireland, and this is the counterfactual, which is a difficult question. All of these questions are speculative, and all suggested solutions, including mine, are necessarily tentative. But was there really a road to Irish independence other than by armed struggle? And you go back to the Fenian movement founded in the 1850s. They established the IRB as a subversive, secret, oath-bound society. They adopted a series of measures to prevent it being infiltrated or suppressed by the British over the following 50 or 60 years. And that basically involved forming small circles rather than a large overt organization, and meeting in secret. And their tactic and strategy was to wait until such time as they could, by force of arms, establish an independent Irish Republic in circumstances that they had the backing of the Irish people. And they knew that their form of separatism in the late 19th century, early 20th century had relatively small public appeal, and that the Home Rule movement seemed to be the project which most Irish nationalists supported. So the idea of full-scale independence in the sense that Ireland was to have its own army, its own flag, its own constitution, its own right to join the League of Nations, its own right to to enter into treaties with other states and conduct its own foreign policy, the right not to participate in wars in which Britain became involved. All of that was that concept of independence was one which was an ambition of the IRB, but was considered either unlikely to be available or not particularly attractive to a great many people in Ireland. And so going back to that speech by John Redmond on St. Patrick's Day in 1913, he was emphasizing to his London audience that Home Rule was a very much that was very much a domestic matter, and that Ireland was not attempting to exit the British Empire, and that Ireland would become an enthusiastic component, first of all, of the United Kingdom, and secondly, of the British Empire, which was dominated then by the United Kingdom, if Home Rule was granted to the Irish people. And that difference of aspiration was fundamental to the events which shaped the drive for Irish independence. Can I remind you too that all of these circumstances, and I know Ronan McCreevy will be saying this in much greater detail than I will, as part of his contribution to this summer school. All of the circumstances which arose were by no means preordained by history. I mean, for instance, the fact that the Irish Volunteers was and could be formed really was, in many respects, a reaction to the Unionists' proclamation of the Ulster Covenant and formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force. It would have been very, very difficult if that hadn't happened, if the Unionist people hadn't threatened the use of force to resist Home Rule, for the Irish Volunteers or any armed force in Ireland to have been established, such as could prosecute a war of independence. So in one sense, and a number of years ago, I spoke at a conference in Belfast. In one sense, you could say that the Ulster Covenant, which was the covenant to resist Home Rule by force, backed by English nationalist Tories at Westminster, was in effect one of the founding documents of Irish independence. Without that, it's very, very hard to see that any armed struggle could ever have taken place in which the British conceded the existence of an independent Irish state. The second thing is that even in relation to the Irish Volunteers, John Redmond effectively attempted to take it over and to bring the volunteers into the First World War. And he succeeded largely in that the great majority of members of the volunteers went with them to join the National Volunteers and to enlist in the British Army to take part in the war in Europe. If he'd succeeded completely, there would have been no volunteers left to fight a war of independence in Ireland. Then you have the 1916 rising. If the British had been less retributive and if they hadn't executed the leaders of 1916, perhaps a wholly different result would have happened. But they did what they did, and their execution of the leaders of 1916 was one of the things which brought about a change in Irish attitudes. And the other thing that I just want to bring to your attention is this, and I'll finish on this point, is that if Owen MacNeill, for instance, hadn't cancelled 1916 in most of the country, the volunteer structure that was there after 1916, and which Collins used to create the IRA, would probably have been annihilated in a much broader rising, which would have been a failure in the end. And so therefore, what my point today is this: when you hear people like John Bruton on occasion saying that, you know, the War of Independence wasn't justified, and that there was a path to Irish independence open through constitutional means, you just have to look at what Redmond was saying in 1913 about his idea of independence, and I quoted that to you. You have to look at what the British were trying to foist on Ireland in 1920 in the Government of Ireland Act. And then it becomes very, very clear that the difference between an independent Irish Free State with international status, joining the League of Nations and developing eventually into the Republic of Ireland, that entity simply would not have happened if there hadn't been the War of Independence. And finally, I make this point: Ireland has prospered hugely as an independent state. And I invite you to consider whether, if the two home rule parliaments had been established and Ireland had remained part of the United Kingdom, whether we would have economically, politically, culturally have survived as a country, let alone prospered to the extent that we have. So to that extent, I think we owe a great deal of gratitude to those patriots who participated in the War of Independence, and we shouldn't be looking over our shoulder and wondering whether there was some question mark over the legitimacy of what they did. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that presentation. I just have two questions here at the moment for you, which I'll read the first one to you. It's from a UK attendee, and he has asked, sorry, now I'll just get it here. Okay, Michael, it's quite lengthy, so I'll just read it out.
Yeah.
Michael, staying on the theme of justified struggle and making the sacrifice of Sean McDermott relevant today, do you, like me, feel disappointed that the Shannon reforms of Maurice Manning are still not applied? Representation of the Irish abroad is of particular interest to me, but these people would have to be elected, not selected. They would then bring all that experience and contacts of the Irish abroad back home. So that comes from a UK listener.
Well, the answer to that is I feel very disappointed that all of my efforts so far, and those of other parliamentarians in the Senate who are interested in reforming it, and we're a minority of senators, which gave rise to a commitment of the Enda Kenny government to reform of the Seanad, has not come to pass yet. And I do believe that it was interesting looking at the model of Senate that the British intended for Southern Ireland, with bishops and peers of the realm and people like that in it, that Senate would have been pretty undemocratic in its form. I think that there's a huge opportunity to use the Senate to have some input from the Irish diaspora. The actual way in which the Senate is elected is not specified in the Constitution. And for instance, I'm an NUI senator, and I am elected in part by people who don't live in Ireland at all, NUI graduates who remain on the register to vote in Senate elections. There is no reason why that should be confined to university graduates. You know, the people living in Northern Ireland, people living in England can vote in the NUI and Trinity electoral panels, but nobody can vote for the other senators. And my good friend Billy Lawless was appointed by Enda Kenny to be a kind of an Irish senator for the diaspora, and he did a huge amount of work to secure voting rights for the Irish diaspora. And I think that I fully accept the proposition: no representation, no taxation without representation, and no representation without taxation. And that applies to Dáil Éireann. I don't think that we have to have voting by the diaspora for Dáil Éireann. But the Senate, in my view, offers a very, very simple way to give the Irish people abroad who treasure their connection with Ireland and who want to have some voice in the Irish Parliament, to have that voice. So I agree very much with the point that the questioner makes.
Michael, another question. Is there a paradox that radical independent Ireland was mainly promoted by the IRB, who had no democratic mandate from the Irish people to pursue, until opinion changed following the imposition of conscription?
Yes, is the answer. There is a paradox there, in this sense that the IRB was a secret organization. It didn't attempt really to be a democratic organization. It couldn't come out into the open. It would have been suppressed if it had pursued its aims openly. But on the other hand, the constitution of the IRB, interestingly, only authorized the use of a kind of only authorized a violent struggle if it had a chance of success. And to some extent, the IRB people, including Sean McDermott in 1916, were acting somewhat against the constitution of the IRB. They were sort of a secret minority within a secret minority in doing what they did. But again, 1916 would have been, I think, or could easily have been, a failure if the British hadn't responded the way they did. I mean, for instance, supposing they'd simply put a cordon around Dublin and slowly, instead of using gunfire, just slowly suppressed the rebels and taken them into custody, there could have been a very different outcome. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that was likely at the time, but we have to remember that probably the biggest spur to the emergence of Sinn Féin and the collapse of the Irish Parliamentary Party was the issue of conscription, because it has united the Church and the Irish people against British rule in Ireland, and the Tories' attempt to apply conscription to Ireland was, if you like, the real catalyst that made it possible for Sinn Féin to do so well in the 1918 elections, and then for the IRB to come out into the open and use the remains of the volunteer organisation to prosecute the War of Independence. So yes, there is a paradox there, but what I'm saying is this: that if it weren't for the triumph of Sinn Féin in the 1918 election, the IRB couldn't possibly have started their guerrilla campaign. If people were still voting for the Irish Parliamentary Party.
Another question, Michael, focusing on necessity of violence. Can your central thesis about the necessity of violence to achieve independence be equally applied to 1969, when peaceful protest seeking civil rights was suppressed by the Unionists and the provisional IRA emerged? Did you hear that, Michael? Would you like me to read that again?
I think I got the gist of it. That that peaceful politics were suppressed, and therefore that the use of violence became legitimate. Well, you see, the problem is this: that I've been reading recently Charles Townsend's book on partition, and what you have to remember is that although we had our own civil war here in 1922-23, we very nearly we were dicing with the whole concept of civil war from 1912 to 1922, a green-orange civil war on this island. I mean, it was a subdued civil war, if you like, but I mean, there were Belfast pogroms and the like taking place. But one of the things that I find fascinating is that if you look at the treaty and the provision for the 6 northern counties to opt out, that was also echoed in Eamon de Valera's document number 2, his alternative treaty, which he proposed to Dáil Éireann at the time of the treaty debates. And I think there was an acceptance in Ireland that the independent Irish state, the more independent it was, the less likely the Unionists were likely to want to be in it. And there's a paradox there, if you like, that that by going for absolute independence, it made the Unionist position more and more entrenched. And what I would say about Northern Ireland now is that that civil war, which didn't really take place between Orange and Green in the 1920s, it was a kind of a civil war in a sense that started in 1969. But on the real issue is that the Unionist people cannot be coerced by violence into an independent Irish state. And what the Good Friday Agreement is a solemn binding international treaty which acknowledges that fact and which makes the consent of a majority in Northern Ireland the absolute prerequisite for either continuing the Union or for having some form of united Ireland. And I think the difference I would draw between what the IRB did in 1919 to 21 and what the IRA did in 1969 to 1999. The difference is this, that in effect, what the IRA were attempting to do was to coerce the majority in Northern Ireland into united Ireland against their wishes. And that was something that the people who founded the independent Irish state never attempted to do and acknowledged should not be done at the time. Eamon de Valera, even though he was responsible in large way for the Civil War, he never suggested coercion of the Northern majority into a united Ireland. And that's where I would part company with the provisional movement. I think that using violence against Irish people to try and force them into a united Ireland is a hopeless cause. And I believe in a united Ireland, and I hope for a united Ireland. But in my heart, I'm sure of one thing, that it can only happen by winning over the free votes of a majority of the people in the North.
So just to come in on that, there's a comment in here from an attendee who says, so 100 years later, can violence be justified not alone in Ireland, but in any part of the world where there is no democracy? So I suppose that just dovetails in with what you said there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem of partition, you can, Charles Townsend's book, I mean, it's well worth a read. It's recently published on the whole origins of partition, the manipulation of the division in Northern Ireland by English nationalists in the form of the Tory party, which is the Conservative and Unionist party. It's happening even today. You can see echoes of it, that English nationalists are trying to so they tried to form an alliance with the DUP, there are many echoes of those of what happened during the War of Independence in present circumstances. But the one thing that didn't happen there was a full-scale Orange versus Green civil war, and I think we're very lucky that it didn't happen then. It could have happened, okay, the nationalist minority in Northern Ireland was very badly treated over many years, and their legitimate protests were gerrymandered out of existence, and they were discriminated against, and all the rest of it. But now I'm very hopeful, because the next census, the latest census in Northern Ireland is probably going to show that of people of Christian faiths, that Catholics and Protestants are roughly equal, about 45% of the population each, or 46% each. And I think there's a great opportunity now for a recalibration of Northern politics, not as one of one ascendancy over the ascendancy of one group over the other, but as a a society which is in balance. And when that balance comes about, I think there will be a new emphasis on partnership, which will eventually, I hope, give rise to a wish to have a united Ireland of one kind or another.
Michael, another question comes in from Patrick. Is it simplistic to suggest that had economic circumstances and development over the entirety of the island of Ireland been the same or equally fair, that there might have been no support for the War of Independence by ordinary people?
There might have been no support for which, sorry?
For the War of Independence by ordinary
I don't know about that. I mean, you go back to the land war of the late 19th century, where the British had to use repressive powers to deal with land agitation, and eventually they brought in the Land Acts, and Irish farmers got to own their own lands. They hoped that that would pacify Ireland. But one of the points that I made earlier on in my contribution was, there was the Gaelic revival, there was the Yeats, Lady Gregory cultural revival taking place in Ireland. There was nationalism growing all across Europe. So there was, I think, a kind of the circumstances in which nationalists and separatists in Ireland began to dream of an independent Ireland were there. Would Ireland have been different if Dublin was as prosperous as Belfast and heavy industry existed in Ireland and we were much more integrated into the British Empire? Perhaps we would have. Perhaps the fact that Ireland was an economic backwater, as I mentioned, or the South was, probably did contribute to a sense of estrangement and disillusionment with British rule in Ireland. And the other thing is that the Act of Union, the way in which the Irish Parliamentary Party were effectively snubbed by the British establishment right up until Asquith's government was formed, and they held the balance of power. All of that, in my view, it could have been very, very different. And I think Ronan McGreevy will be making the point in his contribution, that really the circumstances that actually emerged were not inevitable at all, and that a whole series of different things could have ended up with a very, very different result. But we also have to bear in mind, taking a look at Northern Ireland now, or Wales now, I think Ireland, or the Irish state, the independent Irish state, has benefited hugely from being independent and from being able to pursue its own policies. And therefore, if our economic development had been different in the 19th and early 20th century, yes, it's quite possible there wouldn't have been any a desire for separatism. But that's a long, long time ago, and too many ifs in history, I think, can be. They're interesting to talk about, but the terrible phrase "we are where we are" I think applies. What happened happened, and my point today is that one of the things that wouldn't have happened was Irish independence unless there had been an armed struggle to attempt to achieve it.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to draw this session to a close. Thank you for your presentation today, and thank you very much for your participation in our event.